Dakota Territory, winter of 80 set and arrived without ceremony. There was no single storm that announced it, no dramatic wall of snow rolling across the prairie. Instead, the cold crept in gradually like an unwelcome tenant who never intended to leave. The grasses stiffened first, their golden stalks turning brittle and gray. Then the ponds sealed over in thin glassy layers that cracked under a thrown pebble. Then one morning Jacob Harlow stepped outside his 14 by 16-foot pine cabin and watched his breath pour from his mouth in thick white plumes that did not drift away, but hung suspended in the still air, as if even the wind had frozen. The prairie stretched endless around him, flat and exposed, broken only by distant cottonwoods along a shallow creek. There were no hills to block the wind, no forests to soften its approach. When the northern air decided to move, it moved unchallenged for hundreds of miles before striking whatever stood in its path. Jacob's cabin stood alone against that immensity. Squared logs, stacked and notched, seams packed with mud and bits of moss he had gathered during the warmer months. When he built it in late summer, it had felt sturdy and proud, the best he could manage with his own hands and borrowed tools. By winter, it felt thin. Inside, the cold behaved differently than it did outdoors. Outside it stung and bit, sharp and immediate. Inside it lingered. It hid in corners. It pressed itself against walls and waited. Jacob could feel it most clearly at night. He would lie beneath 2 wool blankets, boots tucked beneath the bed to keep them from stiffening too much by morning, and listen. The logs popped softly as sap pockets reacted to the heat from the fireplace. The wind would find a seam somewhere along the north wall and whistle faintly, a thin high note that rose and fell like distant singing. The fire was never the problem. Jacob knew how to build a fire that roared. He had grown up in Ohio winters where snow came heavy and deep. He understood kindling and draft and how to stack split logs to create a steady burn. The flames in his stone hearth often leapt high enough to throw orange light all the way to the rafters. Yet despite the brightness and heat of it, the cabin refused to grow comfortable. The warmth stayed near the hearth. 3 steps away, the air cooled noticeably. 5 steps, and he could see his breath again. He began noticing small humiliations. The tin cup he left on the table developed a rim of ice by dawn. The water bucket near the door formed a thin crust that needed breaking each morning. The far wall, especially the north-facing one, developed delicate patterns of frost that resembled ferns pressed between glass. They were beautiful in a way, intricate and silent, but their beauty came at the cost of comfort. On the coldest mornings, the frost would thicken into a solid sheet. Jacob once pressed his palm against it out of curiosity and pulled it away with a faint sting, the ice imprinting itself briefly on his skin. It was like living inside a cave that refused to forget the outside world. Neighbors insisted this was simply the cost of prairie living. Burn more wood, they said. That's what it's for. They said it the way one speaks of gravity unchangeable, fundamental. The prairie demanded wood in winter the way it demanded sweat in summer. Jacob cut more wood. He rose before dawn, pulled on stiffened boots, and stepped into air that bit his nostrils. The trees along the creek had thinned noticeably since autumn. He felled what he could, split logs with careful swings of his axe, and hauled them back by sled. His woodpile grew, a proud stack near the south wall of the cabin, but so did his exhaustion. Still, the cabin did not warm. One evening in late November, as the sky turned violet and the horizon swallowed the last smear of orange light, Jacob stood inside and watched something peculiar. He had just stoked the fire heavily. Flames licked high, sparks darted upward, and heat pressed outward in visible waves. He stepped close and felt the warmth soak into his clothes, into his chest, into his hands. It was almost pleasant. Then he tilted his head upward. The air near the rafters shimmered. He could see it heat rising, gathering uselessly against the high ceiling before slipping away into invisible drafts and gaps. The cabin's height, which had once made it feel spacious and hopeful, now felt like a flaw. He was trying to warm an entire volume of air when all he truly needed was warmth where he slept. He took 3 steps back from the fire. The difference startled him. It was as though he had crossed a boundary between seasons. Close to the hearth was autumn. 3 steps away was January. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the invisible gradient of temperature across his own living space. He paced from hearth to door and back again, noting how the cold seemed to pool near the floor and along the outer walls. The cabin was not evenly cold, it was unevenly warm. That distinction mattered. Later that night, wind began its assault. It struck the north wall first, a low, steady force that grew in intensity. Snow hissed against the logs, grains of ice driven sideways so hard they sounded like sand thrown against wood. Jacob lay awake listening to it, feeling each gust press the cabin inward ever so slightly. He imagined the heat inside behaving like a living thing, trying to hold its ground while the cold outside pressed relentlessly inward. The outer walls were the battlefield, and the cold had more territory to attack than the heat could defend. He rose from bed and added another log to the fire. Sparks shot up the chimney. The warmth flared bright and strong again. But when he returned to his blankets, he noticed something else. The ceiling above his bed was high. Too high. The warmest air hovered above him. Unreachable, wasted. Meanwhile, the air at sleeping level cooled quickly. He tucked the blankets tighter around his shoulders and watched his breath plume in the darkness. There was something wrong with the arrangement, not the materials. By mid-December, the cold deepened further. Temperatures fell below zero and stayed there for days. The sun rose pale and weak, offering more light than heat. The prairie turned white and hard, the snow compacted by wind into rippling drifts that resembled frozen waves. Inside the cabin, the fireplace never truly went out. Jacob learned to bank coals carefully at night, covering them in ash so that a faint red glow remained until morning. Even so, by dawn the interior temperature dipped low enough that his fingers felt stiff when he first reached for his boots. He began conducting small experiments without naming them as such. One evening he dragged the table closer to the hearth and noticed that sitting near it required only one blanket over his shoulders instead of two. Another night he hung a spare quilt along the north wall using nails and bits of twine. The difference was subtle but measurable. The frost formed thinner behind the fabric. He observed constantly now. The cabin was no longer simply shelter. It was a system to be understood. Heat rose. Cold sank. Drafts followed predictable paths. The door admitted a rush of icy air each time it opened. The chimney, while necessary, also pulled warm air upward and outward. Every structural feature had consequences. One particularly brutal night. The wind reached a pitch that made the logs hum. Snow built up halfway up the north wall, forming a natural bank that actually reduced some of the draft. Jacob noticed that the cabin felt slightly warmer on that side once the drift grew thick enough. Insulation, even accidental, made a difference. He stood near the hearth and extended his hands again, then stepped backward slowly until he could feel the warmth fade. He marked the spot mentally. 4 feet from the fire was comfortable. 6 feet was tolerable. Beyond that was compromise. Why was he trying to warm all 16 feet? The question settled into him like an ember. He looked around his cabin, the bed against the east wall, the small table, the crate that served as a chair, the hooks holding his coat. It was not a large space by most standards, but compared to the narrow band of warmth around the hearth, it was enormous. He imagined, briefly, what it would feel like if the entire cabin were the size of that warm circle. Smaller, contained. Easier to defend against the cold. The idea seemed almost foolish at first. A cabin inside a cabin? It sounded like something a child might suggest. Yet the longer he stood there, watching the invisible boundary between warm and cold air, the more logical it became. The prairie demanded efficiency. Wood cost time and muscle. If he could reduce the space that needed heating, he could reduce the fuel required to heat it. That night he did not sleep immediately. He lay beneath his blankets and traced the outline of his cabin in his mind. 16 feet long, 14 wide, ceiling high enough that he could stand comfortably even atop a stool. Too much air above him. He imagined building lower? An 8-by-8 enclosure, perhaps. Walls tight and sealed. A ceiling low enough that warm air would not escape upward beyond reach. A small doorway to step inside before bed. It would not require heating the outer walls directly. The fireplace could still warm the larger space somewhat, but the inner structure would trap and hold that warmth longer. He rolled onto his side and listened to the wind again. Another gust struck, and he felt a faint ribbon of cold air snake across the floor toward his bed. The sensation sharpened his resolve. The cold had too many entry points and too much room to roam. Morning came gray and brittle. Jacob rose stiffly, broke the ice in the water bucket, and stepped outside. The sky was clear but hard, the sun a pale disk. He looked at his cabin from the outside, studying its lines. It looked solid, respectable, but looks did not determine warmth. He walked slowly around it, noting where snow accumulated most deeply, where wind scarred the walls bare, where the mud chinking had cracked. He pressed his mittened hand against the north wall and felt the vibration of wind pushing against it. The prairie was not malicious. It was indifferent. Survival depended on adapting to that indifference. When he returned inside, he stood in the center of the room and turned slowly in a circle. His breath was visible again despite the morning fire. The frost along the far wall sparkled faintly in the light from the single window. He could continue as he had been cutting more wood, feeding the fire endlessly, accepting the gradient of warmth as inevitable. Or he could change the shape of the problem. The thought did not feel dramatic. It felt practical. He dragged the table aside, clearing the central floor. The cabin suddenly seemed larger, without its sparse furniture interrupting the space. He imagined posts rising from that cleared area, logs stacked to form inner walls. He imagined stepping into that smaller room at night and closing a simple wooden door behind him. He walked to the hearth and extended his hands once more, then stepped backward again, counting paces. 4 steps to comfort. Beyond that, compromise. He did not need 16 feet of compromise. He needed 8 feet of comfort. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a faint tremor through the logs. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, doing its best against a volume too large for it to conquer fully. Jacob crouched and placed his palm flat against the wooden floor near the center of the room. It was cold, but not as cold as the edges. The center retained warmth longer. That would be the heart of it. A room within a room, not larger. Smaller. He stood slowly, brushing sawdust from his knees, and looked around once more. The cabin seemed to wait, silent and unjudging. The cold had taught him something in these weeks, something the summer warmth never could. Space was not always a blessing. Sometimes it was a liability. He stepped to the door and looked out across the frozen prairie. Smoke rose thinly from distant cabins, each family fighting the same battle with flame and wood. They would cut more trees, burn more logs, accept the gradient. Jacob closed the door gently and turned back toward the center of his cabin. The idea no longer felt foolish. It felt necessary. The first log he carried inside was straight and heavy, nearly 10 feet long, still rough with bark along one edge. Jacob shouldered it through the doorway carefully, angling it to avoid scraping the frame. The cabin was not large to begin with, and maneuvering full-length timbers inside required patience. He lowered the log to the floor in the center of the room where he had cleared space the day before. For a long moment he simply stood over it, hands on hips, breath fogging in the cool interior air. It did look strange. Logs belonged in walls, not in the middle of a finished room. Firewood belonged stacked neatly near the hearth, not laid out like foundation beams across the floorboards. Even to his own eyes, the sight of that single timber resting in the center of his cabin carried the faint scent of madness. But he had not miscalculated the cold. He had felt it too many nights in a row to doubt the need for change. He fetched another log, then another. By midday, 4 timbers lay arranged in a rough square, 8 feet by 8 feet, centered slightly closer to the hearth than to the outer walls. He measured the space carefully with a length of twine he had knotted at foot intervals. 8 feet felt right, large enough to hold his bed and a narrow walkway, small enough to minimize wasted air. He set the first course of logs as though building an entirely new cabin, notched at the corners so they locked together. The rhythm returned to him quickly, the steady chop of axe against wood, the careful shaving to ensure a tight fit. Chips scattered across the floor. Resin scent filled the room, sharp and fresh. The act of building inside an already built structure felt peculiar. The walls of the outer cabin loomed only a few feet beyond the growing inner frame. It was like constructing a house inside a barn. By afternoon, the first layer stood knee-high. That was when Eli Turner arrived. Eli did not knock. Few neighbors did. The prairie bred a kind of practical familiarity. Doors were barriers against weather, not against people. Eli pushed the door inward and stamped snow from his boots. He stopped mid-step. "What in God's name are you doing, Jacob?" Jacob did not look up immediately. He adjusted the corner notch of a log and pressed it down into place before answering. "Building," he said simply. Eli stepped closer, circling the square structure slowly. "Building what?" "A room." Eli barked a short laugh. "You already got one." Jacob finally straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Too much of one." Eli squinted at him, uncertain whether this was humor. "You aiming to cut your cabin in half?" "Not in half. Smaller." Eli stepped over one of the laid logs and stood inside the square outline. He turned slowly, arms slightly extended as if measuring space. "You building a pen? Planning to bring a goat indoors?" Jacob shook his head. "For sleeping?" Eli stared at him for a long moment, then laughed louder, the sound filling the cabin. "You are building yourself a box to sleep in?" "Something like that." "Why not just pile more blankets on your bed like the rest of us?" "Blankets donned, stop drafts from taking the heat." Eli's amusement softened slightly at that. He glanced toward the north wall, where frost still clung in faint patterns despite the midday fire. "It's cold for all of us." "I know. Then cut more wood." Jacob's jaw tightened faintly. "I have been." Eli walked back outside the square and leaned against the outer wall, studying the half-built structure with open skepticism. "You know folks are going to talk." "They already do. That dawn bother you?" Jacob shrugged. "Cold bothers me more." Eli stayed a few minutes longer, offering unsolicited suggestions, mostly variations of "burn it hotter." and seal your chinking again." Then he left, shaking his head as he pulled the door close behind him. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Jacob stood alone with the growing inner frame and let the echo of Eli's laughter settle. It did not sting as much as he might have expected. He had anticipated disbelief. The idea sounded absurd when reduced to its simplest description, a cabin within a cabin, but he had felt the temperature difference with his own body. He had stood in the gradient between warmth and cold and recognized inefficiency when he sensed it. By evening, the inner walls rose to waist height. He paused to build up the fire, watching flames lick upward and heat spread through the outer room. The air above shimmered again, warm near the rafters and cool at shoulder level. He stepped inside the new square and crouched. Already the space felt different. Even without a roof, even without full height. The mere suggestion of walls altered the air movement. The draft that usually skimmed across the floor seemed to break slightly against the partial barrier. It was subtle, but real. The next morning brought more visitors. Word traveled fast in small settlements. By mid-morning, two brothers Caleb and Martin Shaw appeared together, their boots thudding heavily on the cabin floor as they entered uninvited. "Well, I'll be damned," Caleb muttered. Martin let out a low whistle. He was tea-joking. Jacob continued working, stacking another log atop the growing wall. He refused to grant them the satisfaction of immediate explanation. Caleb circled slowly. "You planning to rent out the outer half?" "Charge admission?" Martin chuckled. "Maybe he's afraid of ghosts." Building himself a safe box. Jacob set the log carefully and checked its alignment before responding. "I am building something that holds heat." Martin snorted. "Heat as held by fire, not walls." "Walls hold air," Jacob replied evenly. "Air holds heat." The brothers exchanged a glance that suggested they were not interested in further physics. "You're wasting good timber," Caleb said finally. "Should have used it to reinforce your north wall. My north wall is holding, for now." Jacob did not argue. He knew argument would only feed their amusement. Instead, he climbed atop the half-built wall to adjust the corner notch of the next log. The act of working while being observed sharpened his focus. He shaved wood carefully, ensuring each seam fit tightly. If he was to endure mockery, the structure would at least be sound. By late afternoon, the inner walls reached chest height. The brothers departed eventually, laughter trailing behind them like wind. Jacob remained, stacking and fitting until his shoulders ached. When dusk settled, he lit 2 candles and stood back to study his progress. The inner square now clearly divided the cabin, creating a narrow walkway between its outer surface and the original walls. The space did not feel smaller yet. It felt layered. He imagined finishing it raising walls to full height, adding a low roof, perhaps insulating the gaps more carefully than he had the outer cabin in his rush to finish before first snow. He imagined stepping inside at night and closing a small door. The image steadied him. On the 3rd day, the mockery grew louder. 3 men entered together Eli again, along with Caleb and a newcomer named Harris Doyle. Harris was known for his bluntness, and he did not disappoint. "You finally lost it, Harlow?" Jacob wiped sweat from his brow. "Afternoon, Harris." Harris walked straight up to the structure and rapped his knuckles against the logs. "You building a coffin big enough to pace in?" "Bedroom," Jacob replied calmly. Harris laughed hard enough to bend forward slightly. "Inside your bedroom." "Inside my cabin." Eli, who had begun to look slightly less amused and slightly more curious, asked, "You figure it'll really make that much difference?" Jacob paused. "I think it will." "Based on what?" Harris challenged. "Based on where it is warm and where it is." Harris gestured broadly around the cabin. "It is cold everywhere, not equally." The distinction hung in the air. Harris scoffed, cold as cold. "No," Jacob said quietly. "It isn't tea." He walked to the hearth and extended his hand close to the flames, then stepped back several feet. "Here," he said. "Feel it." Reluctantly, Eli followed, holding his palm near the fire before stepping backward. "Well?" "Warmer up close," Eli admitted. "And if you only had to warm that close?" Jacob pressed. Harris rolled his eyes. "You going to sleep standing next to the fireplace?" "No," Jacob replied. "I am going to shrink the space I sleep in." The men looked at one another again. The idea hovered between absurd and unsettling. "You are making winter worse in your head," Harris muttered finally. "You'll freeze just the same." "Maybe," Jacob said. But his voice held no doubt. By the end of the week, the inner walls reached nearly full height. He deliberately built them lower than the outer cabin, a ceiling about 7 feet tall, intending to add a flat roof that would trap rising heat closer to where he stood. Constructing that roof inside the cabin required ingenuity. He cut shorter beams and lifted them into place carefully, balancing them atop the inner walls. Sawdust fell like pale snow as he shaped each joint. Working indoors through winter felt almost surreal. Outside, wind continued its steady assault. Inside, another structure grew. The laughter did not stop. Children peeked through the doorway just to giggle at the sight. One neighbor, his wife, reportedly told another that Jacob must be planning to store grain inside his house for fear of theft. Rumors bloomed easily in cold weather. One afternoon, as he set the final roof plank in place atop the inner cabin, Harris returned alone. He stood silently this time, studying the nearly complete structure. "You are serious," Harris said at last. "I am. You will cut your space in half." "I'll cut my heat loss in half," Jacob corrected. Harris crossed his arms. "Or trap smoke and suffocate." "I am not sealing it airtight." "You sure about that?" Jacob stepped inside the nearly enclosed space and spoke from within. His voice echoed slightly off the closed walls. "I am sure." Harris peered through the doorway opening. The interior was dim but noticeably less drafty already. "You were stubborn," Harris said. "About warmth," Jacob replied. Harris shook his head and left without further insult. When Jacob finally set the small door into place, a simple plank construction on iron hinges, the transformation felt complete. The inner cabin stood fully formed, an 8-by-8 room, 7 feet high, nested inside the larger structure like a wooden box within a box. He stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. The outer cabin's sounds muted slightly. The wind, as whistle, softened. Even without fire blazing high, the air felt stiller. He stood there in the quiet and allowed himself a rare, faint smile. Let them laugh. Let them call it foolish. The prairie did not reward pride. It rewarded results. That night, as snow began falling again in thin, dry sheets, several neighbors gathered briefly outside his cabin. Through the window, they could see the silhouette of the inner structure. "Looks like a crate," someone muttered. "He'll regret it when the smoke backs up. He'll regret it when he splits his floor from the weight." Laughter drifted into the wind. Inside, Jacob fed the fire carefully and waited. The true answer would not come from argument. It would come from the cold. The storm did not arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty. All afternoon, the sky had been the color of hammered tin, flat and metallic, pressing low over the prairie. The air felt wrong, too still, too tight in the lungs. Even the horses in the distant paddock of the Shaw brothers had turned their backs northward before the first gust came. Jacob sensed it long before sunset. He had lived on the prairie long enough to recognize the silence that preceded violence. The usual low winter wind had dropped away entirely, leaving a strange vacuum in its place. Smoke from his chimney rose straight upward in a thin gray column without drifting. That frightened him more than wind. Inside the outer cabin, the fire burned steady. Inside the inner cabin, the air already felt different, quieter, more contained. He had spent the past few nights testing it cautiously, stepping inside for an hour at a time, gauging the difference. Even without a full blizzard outside, he could tell the smaller space held warmth longer after the fire settled. But tonight would be the true measure. By late afternoon, the northern horizon darkened not like a cloud bank, but like a wall. Snow did not fall at first. The wind came alone, striking hard and sudden, slamming against the north wall, with a force that made the logs creak in protest. Jacob stood near the hearth and listened. The first gust rattled the door latch. The second drove fine powder snow sideways across the single window, hissing against the glass. The third carried a sound deeper than Wendell, sustained roar that did not fade. He fed 2 more thick logs into the fire and adjusted the draft. Flames surged brighter, licking high into the chimney throat. The temperature had already been bitter before the storm. That morning his breath had hung heavy even near the hearth. By sundown, he suspected it would drop further. He stepped outside briefly, bracing himself. The wind struck him like a physical blow, stealing his breath instantly. Snow swirled horizontally, not falling but flying. He could barely see 10 yards across the prairie. The world had become a white blur, sky and ground indistinguishable. He turned his back to the wind and forced his way back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The cabin shuddered faintly. For a moment he stood with his back against the door, listening to the storm gather strength. The logs groaned softly under pressure. Snow began piling rapidly against the north wall, forming a drifting bank that would either help insulate or threaten to bury. He moved to the center of the outer room. Already he could feel the familiar pattern, the warmth close to the fire, the creeping cold along the walls. But tonight the difference sharpened faster than before. The storm was pulling heat outward with greater hunger. He paced slowly from hearth to north wall. Near the hearth, tolerable. 3 steps away, a chill. 5 steps, breath visible again. The gradient had returned in force. He turned toward the inner cabin, the 8x8 structure standing solid and square in the center of the room. Its small wooden door waited, simple and unadorned. He had built it as an experiment. Tonight it would become necessity. As darkness swallowed the prairie entirely, the wind intensified further. Snow struck so hard against the outer walls that it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown in constant waves. The chimney moaned faintly as wind passed over its top, altering the draft. Jacob adjusted the fire again, careful not to overdraw and waste heat up the flue. He wanted steady, sustained warmth, not a brief blaze. The temperature outside, he estimated, was falling below 30°. Inside, even with the fire strong, he could feel cold gathering in corners like a living thing waiting its turn. He carried his lantern and stepped into the inner cabin for the first time with full intention of staying the night. Closing the small door behind him felt symbolic. The outer room's roar muted slightly, reduced to a lower, more distant thunder. The air inside the inner cabin felt immediately calmer, less movement, fewer invisible currents brushing against his skin. He placed the lantern on a small crate and stood still. He could hear his own breathing clearly now. The inner walls, tightly chinked with moss and cloth, gave off a faint scent of resin and fiber. The low ceiling hovered only inches above his head when he stood upright. It felt close, but not suffocating. Contained. He extended his hands. They did not feel as cold. The warmth from the outer fire seeped in gradually through the doorway gap and the shared air above the doorframe. But unlike the larger room, it did not dissipate upward into unreachable rafters. It collected. He left the inner door slightly ajar for now, and returned to the hearth to adjust the logs once more. The outer cabin had already grown markedly colder away from the fire. Frost thickened along the north wall, forming a cloudy sheet. He stepped back inside the inner structure and closed the door more firmly. The change was subtle but undeniable. The wind roared outside. The outer walls bore the assault. The fire crackled steadily. But within the 8-foot square, the air remained almost still. Hours passed. The storm deepened into something relentless. Gusts no longer came in intervals. They sustained. The cabin vibrated faintly at times, as though the prairie itself were trying to shift it off its foundation. Jacob fed the fire one final time before midnight and then retreated fully into the inner cabin, shutting the door tight. He sat on the edge of his bed, boots off, blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The difference astonished him. In the outer cabin, he had needed 2 blankets and still felt cold at his shoulders. Here, after only minutes, the air around him grew noticeably warmer. His breath no longer formed thick clouds. It thinned. He touched the inner wall. It felt cool, but not icy. He stood and pressed his palm against the outer cabin wall just outside the inner structure. That wall felt frozen. The contrast was stark. He returned inside and latched the door gently. For the first time since early winter began, he felt something unfamiliar at nightfall. Relief. He lay down cautiously, half expecting some unseen flaw to reveal itself, smoke creeping in, air thinning, some oversight he had not considered. But the ventilation gap he had intentionally left near the roofline allowed slow air exchange without permitting significant draft. But the storm screamed. Snow pounded. But inside the smaller space, warmth accumulated instead. An hour passed. Then another. The fire outside burned lower, its roar softening to a steady crackle. In the outer cabin, the temperature would normally drop quickly as flames subsided. Inside the inner cabin, the decline was gradual, almost imperceptible. He removed 1 blanket. That act alone felt miraculous. He had not slept with a single blanket all winter. He lay back and listened carefully to his own body. His toes were not stiff. His fingers were not numb. His shoulders were not hunched against creeping cold. The air felt breathable, calm, stable. Outside, the temperature likely plunged toward 40 UF. Inside the outer cabin, frost would be thickening aggressively. Inside the inner cabin, warmth persisted. Sometime in the deep hours of night, he rose quietly and opened the inner door slightly to gauge the difference. Cold air from the outer cabin rolled in instantly like water through a breached dam. It was dramatic. He closed the door again quickly, heart pounding not from fear, but from confirmation. The outer room had surrendered to the storm. The inner room had not. He retrieved a small mercury thermometer he had purchased months earlier from a supply wagon. He had rarely used it indoors before. He had not wanted the discouragement. He placed it outside the inner cabin door briefly, holding it near the outer room's center. The reading dropped steadily, below 0, then further. He stepped back inside the inner room and placed it on the crate near his bed. He waited. The mercury climbed, not dramatically at first, but steadily. He checked again after several minutes. 31 degrees difference. He stared at it, uncertain whether fatigue was distorting his perception. He repeated the process. Outer room, bitter. Inner room, markedly warmer. 31 degrees. He let out a slow breath. He had not burned more wood. He had not fed the fire excessively. He had simply reduced the space required to hold warmth. He returned to bed and lay awake for some time, absorbing the realization. The storm continued without mercy. Yet for the first time that winter, he did not feel at its mercy. Near dawn, the wind shifted slightly, altering its tone from a direct assault to a lower sustained howl. Snow had banked high against the north wall, adding unintended insulation. Inside the inner cabin, the air remained steady. When morning light finally filtered faintly through the outer window, Jacob rose cautiously and opened the inner door. The outer cabin greeted him with a shock of cold so sharp it stole his breath. Frost coated the far wall thickly, nearly opaque. The water bucket had frozen solid despite proximity to the dying embers. His boots near the outer wall felt stiff as boards. He stepped back inside the inner room briefly just to feel the contrast again. Warm. He allowed himself one quiet moment of satisfaction before reopening the door and tending to the fire. When he finally stepped outside to assess the damage, snow reached halfway up the north wall. Drifts had formed sculpted ridges across the prairie. The world felt carved from ice. Across the distance, thin columns of smoke rose from neighboring cabins. He wondered how they had fared. Later that morning, Eli forced his way through waist-deep drifts to reach Jacob's door. "You alive in there?" he called before entering. Jacob opened the door fully. Eli stomped inside, face red from cold. "Lord above, it is like a freezer in here," Eli muttered, rubbing his hands. "It was colder before sunrise," Jacob replied. Eli's gaze shifted to the inner structure. "You sleep in that thing?" "I did." Eli stepped toward it skeptically. "Well?" Jacob opened the small door and gestured. Eli stepped inside cautiously. He stopped. His eyebrows rose slowly. "It's warmer." "Yes." "How much?" Jacob handed him the thermometer. Eli read it, then looked back toward the outer room and then back at the number. "You're telling me it stayed like this all night?" "Yes." Eli stepped back outside the inner cabin and immediately flinched at the cold difference. He looked at Jacob with something that was no longer laughter. "That is a hell of a difference." 31 degrees, Jacob said quietly. Eli shook his head slowly, absorbing the reality. Did you burn more wood?" "No." The wind howled faintly outside again, though less violently than during the night. Peak. Eli stepped once more into the inner room and closed the small door behind him. From within, his voice sounded calmer. "Feels like another world in here." Jacob nodded. That was exactly what it felt like, not a larger fire. Not thicker blankets. A smaller world to warm. The storm had come to test his idea, and the idea had endured. By the time the storm loosened its grip on the prairie, word had already begun to travel. It did not spread formally. No one stood in the road announcing figures or citing thermometers. It moved the way information always moved in winter quietly, from doorway to doorway, carried in low voices while hands hovered over weak fires. Jacob had not intended to make a demonstration of anything. He had simply endured the night and measured what he felt. But Eli Turner was not a man built for silence, especially when something surprised him. He slept warmer. Eli told Caleb Shaw 2 days after the storm. 30 degrees warmer, he says. Caleb had laughed at first, assuming exaggeration, but Eli was insistent. "I stood in it," he said. "It's not a guess." Skepticism turned to curiosity quickly in cold weather. The storm had been brutal. Several families had burned nearly half their remaining woodpile in a single night trying to keep frost from climbing their interior walls. Harris Doyle, as youngest, had woken coughing from the smoke of an overdrawn chimney. The Shaws had slept in shifts, keeping the fire alive. So when Eli mentioned that Jacob had used no extra wood and had removed a blanket by midnight, the laughter faded. 3 evenings after the storm, Caleb Shaw appeared at Jacob's door alone. Jacob recognized the look immediately. It was not mockery this time. It was calculation. "You got a minute?" Caleb asked, stamping snow from his boots. Jacob stepped aside. The outer cabin still felt cold in its corners, though the day's fire kept the center tolerable. The inner structure stood quietly in place, unchanged. Caleb walked around it slowly, running a gloved hand along the logs. "You measured it?" he asked. "I did." "With that little mercury stick?" "Yes." Caleb crouched slightly, peering at the seam between the inner wall and the outer floorboards. "You seal this tight." "As tight as I could." Caleb stood and exhaled slowly. "You figure it as the smaller space?" "Yes." "Not some trick of the storm?" "The storm made it worse," Jacob replied. "That is what proved it." Caleb stepped inside the inner cabin and closed the door. The difference registered instantly on his face. He remained silent for nearly half a minute, simply standing there, breathing. When he stepped back out, he did not laugh. "How long you think that heat holds once the fire dies down?" he asked. "Longer than the outer room," Jacob said. "It doesn't have as much air to fill." Caleb nodded slowly. He left without teasing. Over the next week, more neighbors came. Some pretended to be passing by. Others admitted openly they wanted to see for themselves. Harris Doyle arrived again. This time without the heavy sarcasm he usually carried like a coat. "You mind if I look close?" he asked. Jacob nodded. Harris inspected the structure methodically. He pressed at the chinking. He examined the roof beams. He even crouched to inspect the small ventilation gap near the top corner, where Jacob had intentionally left a narrow space for air exchange. "You did. T seal it airtight," Harris muttered. "I said I would, T. Smoke build up at all?" "No." Harris stepped inside and closed the door. A few seconds later, his voice came muffled from within. "I'll be damned." When he emerged, his expression had changed from disbelief to something resembling reluctant respect. "Heat rises," Harris said thoughtfully. "Yes. And you cut the rise?" "I cut the waste," Jacob corrected. That distinction lingered in Harris's mind. The science of it, though no one in the settlement would have called it science, began to surface in quiet conversations. Heat rose. That was common knowledge. Anyone who had ever stood near a fire understood that warmth gathered near the ceiling first. Large cabins meant large volumes of air. That air required fuel to warm, and once warmed it drifted upward beyond reach, escaping through cracks in the chimney. Jacob had not increased the heat source. He had reduced the volume. He had shortened the path heat needed to travel before it could be felt. One evening, Eli returned with a scrap of paper and charcoal. "Explain it to me," he said, sitting at Jacob's table. Jacob drew a simple square on the paper. "This is the cabin." Then he drew arrows rising from a small circle, representing the fire. "Heat goes up." He shaded the upper portion of the square dark. "That's where most of it sits." Then he drew a smaller square inside the larger one. "If I only warm this much space," he said, tapping the inner shape, "the heat does have as far to go before it fills it." Eli scratched his beard. "So it is not hotter because you made more heat. It is hotter because you trapped it closer." "Yes, and less wall means less cold pushing in." "Yes." Eli nodded slowly. "You ever think about that before winter?" "No," Jacob admitted. "I thought a bigger room meant comfort." Eli laughed softly at that. So did the rest of us. The idea spread not as revelation but as realization. Each neighbor could recall standing near their own hearth and feeling the warmth vanish only a few feet away. They had simply accepted it. Acceptance cost wood. Wood cost labor. Labor cost strength. By mid-January, the settlement's tone toward Jacob shifted entirely. The word fool disappeared. In its place came quieter phrases. "Maybe he onto something. Maybe I'll try a smaller partition. Maybe just around the bed." The first imitation was crude. Caleb Shaw hung thick canvas from ceiling beams to create a makeshift sleeping corner. It was not as solid as Jacob's structure, but it cut drafts and trapped warmth around the bed. Caleb reported a noticeable difference. Then Harris Doyle built a partial wall of stacked planks around his family's sleeping area. It looked awkward and unfinished, but his wife admitted the children coughed less at night. No one said Jacob had been right, but they stopped saying he had been wrong. Jacob refined his own structure quietly. He added an additional layer of moss insulation between the inner logs where small gaps had formed as the wood dried. He sealed the base seam, where the inner wall met the floorboards, with strips of cloth dipped in wax. He lowered his bed slightly to keep it within the densest layer of warm air. He paid attention to patterns. When the fire burned bright in the outer cabin, warm air seeped gently into the inner structure and stayed. When the fire died down to embers, the inner cabin cooled gradually, not sharply. He began measuring regularly. Outer room, near freezing on bitter nights. Inner room, consistently 95 degrees warmer. The number varied slightly depending on wind, but the difference remained significant. One evening, Harris returned again, this time bringing his eldest son. "Show him," Harris said simply. The boy stepped inside the inner cabin and smiled faintly. "Feels like summer," he said. Jacob almost laughed at that. It was nowhere near summer, but compared to the biting cold of the outer room, it might as well have been. The science of heat loss revealed itself more clearly with each observation. The outer cabin had 4 walls exposed directly to the wind. The inner cabin shared warmth from all sides except the small door seam. Its surface area was reduced. The amount of exterior exposure per cubic foot air was dramatically lower. Less exposure meant less heat transfer outward. Jacob did not use such formal terms, but he felt the principle intuitively. The prairie wind attacked large surfaces aggressively. It found cracks. It exploited space. The smaller room gave it less territory. One particularly cold afternoon, when the temperature failed to rise above 15 degrees, even under full sun, a small group gathered in Jacob's outer cabin to discuss it openly. Eli, Caleb, Harris, and Martin stood near the hearth while Jacob demonstrated again. "Stand here," he said, positioning them 6 feet from the fire. They nodded at the chill. Then he opened the inner cabin door. "Now, step inside." One by one, they entered. The shift was immediate. "Damn," Martin muttered. Caleb ran his palm along the inner wall. "It is not the fire," he said slowly. "It is the space." "Yes." Harris crossed his arms. "We built big because we thought it meant comfort." "It means volume," Jacob said. "And volume eats heat." "Yes." Silence followed. Outside, the wind swept snow in low spirals across the prairie. Inside, 5 men stood in a smaller square of warmth. That moment marked the true turning point. The idea no longer belonged solely to Jacob. It belonged to winter itself. By February, 3 cabins in the settlement had some version of an inner sleeping chamber. Not all were built with full logs. Some used thick quilts hung carefully to reduce airflow. Others stacked crates and planks. Each adaptation varied, but the principle held: smaller space, less loss. Warmer nights. Woodpiles lasted longer than expected. Illness decreased slightly. Children slept more soundly. Jacob noticed something subtle but profound in the weeks that followed. The laughter had not merely stopped. It had transformed into quiet consultation. Neighbors now asked him how wide to build, how high to make the ceiling, whether to leave a ventilation gap. He answered simply: "Low enough to keep heat near you. Seal the base tight. Leave just enough air to breathe." He did not boast. He did not remind them of their earlier mockery. The prairie had humbled them all equally. One evening, as he sat inside his inner cabin listening to the fire settle outside, he reflected on how small the change truly was. He had not invented a new fuel. He had not discovered a new material. He had simply reconsidered space. Space, which in summer felt like freedom, in winter became burden. Heating the prairie was impossible. Heating 8 feet by 8 feet was manageable. Outside, another wind began to rise, not as violent as the great storm, but sharp enough to remind everyone that winter had not yet finished its lesson. Jacob lay back beneath a single blanket. The air inside his smaller room felt steady, dependable. Beyond the thin wooden door, the outer cabin creaked and surrendered small degrees of warmth to the night. But within the inner walls, warmth held its ground. The neighbors had laughed when he began. Now they listened when he spoke. And the prairie, indifferent as ever, continued to test every wall that stood against it. By the time the second deep freeze of the season arrived, the settlement no longer looked the same at night. From the outside, the cabins appeared unchanged low-log structures crouched against the endless prairie, smoke lifting thinly into the brittle air. But inside, something subtle had shifted. The wide, open, single-room interiors that had once defined frontier simplicity were slowly dividing into smaller, warmer cores. It began quietly. Caleb Shaw's canvas partition was the first imitation, but it did not remain the only one for long. After the success of Jacob's inner cabin during the Great Storm, others stopped pretending they were merely curious. They began asking direct questions. How thick are your inner walls? Did you anchor it to the floor? How do you keep it from sweating with frost? Jacob answered each patiently. He never claimed mastery. He simply described what he had observed. Smaller space held warmth longer. Tight seams mattered. Air must move slowly, not freely. Soon, the settlement entered what Eli jokingly called the imitation season. Where once men gathered to compare axe heads or trade nails, they now discussed measurements. 8 by 8 seemed common, but some adjusted based on family size. Harris Doyle built a 10 by 8 enclosure to accommodate his wife and 2 children. Martin Shaw reduced his design to just large enough for a bed platform and a narrow bench. The sound of hammering returned to cabins that had already been declared finished months earlier. The irony did not go unnoticed. We built too big the first time, Caleb admitted one evening as he helped Harris lift a roof beam into place inside the Doyle cabin. Big felt like success, Harris replied. Warm feels like survival. The distinction mattered. Jacob observed these changes with quiet satisfaction but also caution. Not every attempt worked immediately. Caleb's first canvas wall trapped warmth but also moisture. Frost formed along the fabric and melted in the morning, dampening bedding. After consulting Jacob, He added a thin wooden frame behind the canvas to create a small air gap. The moisture problem lessened. Harris initially sealed his enclosure too tightly. By morning, the air felt stale, and condensation gathered heavily near the ceiling. He reopened a small ventilation slit near the top corner just as Jacob had done. Balance returned. Through trial and adjustment, the settlement began learning something more valuable than a design. They were learning principles. Heat rose. Surface area mattered. Airflow determined comfort. Volume dictated fuel consumption. The prairie had forced them to become students of invisible forces. One bitter evening in late January, when the temperature again plunged well below zero, Eli invited several neighbors into his cabin to test his newly built sleeping box. It was smaller than Jacob, as 6 feet by 8, but tightly sealed and capped with a low plank roof. "Don't laugh," Eli said defensively as Jacob stepped inside. Jacob did. He closed the small door behind them and stood quietly. The warmth difference was noticeable, though not as dramatic as his own structure during the first storm. Still, it was enough. "You burn more wood?" Jacob asked. "Less," Eli replied. "That is the strangest part." Across the room, Eli's wife folded blankets with a faint smile. "And he does complain about drafts half the night anymore," she added. Eli grinned sheepishly. What began as ridicule had become refinement. Even families who lacked enough timber for full log enclosures improvised. Quilts were layered. Crates were stacked to form low barriers. Some built partial ceilings over their beds to trap rising heat closer to sleeping level. The settlement-esque cabins began to resemble layered shells rather than hollow boxes. And something else changed alongside the structures. Wood piles lasted longer. The difference was not dramatic enough to make winter easy, but it was noticeable enough to reduce anxiety. Where once men counted their remaining stacks with tightening chests by mid-February, now they found themselves cautiously optimistic. Jacob himself refined his inner cabin further during this imitation season. He added a second interior door and improvised airlock of sorts. It was nothing more than a hanging wool blanket placed just inside the wooden door. When he entered at night, he would close the outer cabin door behind him, step inside the inner space, then drop the blanket before shutting the wooden door. The extra layer reduced the brief rush of cold air when entering. He also lowered his bed frame slightly. After weeks of observation, he realized that the warmest air gathered not at floor level, but just above waist height within the small space. By adjusting his sleeping platform, he positioned himself in the densest warmth zone. These small refinements accumulated. He began keeping simple note scraps of charcoal markings on leftover board pieces. Outside temperature approximations. Fire size. Inner room temperature dawn. Wood consumed. It was not formal science, but it was consistent observation. One night, after a light snowfall and steady wind, he measured a 28-degree difference between the outer and inner rooms using minimal fire. Another night, during still air but extreme cold, the difference reached 93 degrees. The pattern held. Less space required less heat to feel warm. Neighbors started referring to their inner structures with nicknames. Sleeping box. Warm square, hollow room. Jacob objected gently to the last one. "It is not mine," he insisted. "It's just smaller space." But the association remained. By early February, 3 more cabins had implemented variations. The settlement, once uniform in its single-room simplicity, now displayed quiet ingenuity. Even pride shifted it. At first, building large had signaled prosperity. A tall ceiling suggested ambition. A wide room implied permanence. Now, smaller interior signaled wisdom. The prairie had reshaped their definition of success. One evening, Harris Doyle approached Jacob with an idea. "What if," Harris began cautiously, "we built outer walls thicker next year?" Jacob considered it. "It would help, but it's more timber." "Yes." Harris nodded toward the inner cabin. "This took less." Jacob smiled faintly. "Sometimes less does more." The imitation season extended beyond mere copying. It became adaptation. Martin Shaw experimented with double-layered chinking inside his inner enclosure, mixing mud with straw for better insulation. Caleb tried lining the ceiling of his sleeping box with flattened flour, sacks filled lightly with dried grass, creating a primitive insulating layer. Not all attempts succeeded. One poorly ventilated enclosure grew heavy with moisture and had to be dismantled and rebuilt. Another proved too small, creating discomfort despite warmth. But the overall effect was undeniable. Families reported fewer frost-coated blankets in the morning. Children woke less often from cold discomfort. Fire tending became more manageable. And wood precious, labor-earned wood lasted longer. Jacob noticed something else as winter wore on. The atmosphere among neighbors softened. The early laughter had carried a sharp edge. It was the sound of men defending their own choices by mocking another's deviation. Now conversations felt collaborative. How high did you build yours? 7 feet. I went 6. There? For my size, yes. These exchanges carried no ridicule, only learning. One particular cold morning in mid-February, Jacob stepped outside to find Harris examining his woodpile. You still got that much? Harris asked, surprised. Yes. You have burned through it by now last year. Yes. Harris nodded slowly. We all would have. They stood in silence for a moment, watching pale sunlight spill across the snow. I laughed at you, Harris admitted finally. I remember, Jacob said lightly. Harris rubbed his gloves together. You did argue much. No point arguing with cold, Jacob replied. Harris gave a small chuckle at that. The imitation season had done more than spread a design, it had altered thinking. The settlers began to question other assumptions too. If space could be reduced to conserve heat, perhaps other aspects of frontier living could be refined. Could doors be sealed better? Could windows be shuttered more tightly at night? Could chimneys be adjusted to draw less aggressively? Winter, once accepted as an unchangeable adversary, became something to negotiate with. Not defeat. Negotiate. As February edged toward March, the sun lingered slightly longer in the sky each evening. Temperatures still plunged at night, but daytime thaw hinted faintly at coming change. Inside Jacob's inner cabin, the air remained steady and predictable. He often sat on his bed at night, listening to the outer room creak softly as it cooled, and reflected on how small the shift had been. He had not built outward. He had built inward. He had not increased. He had reduced. The imitation season did not produce identical cabins across the settlement. Each family adapted according to resources and need, but the core lesson held firm. Heat is not only about fire, it is about space. When the final hard freeze of the season swept through in early March, fewer complaints rose from neighboring chimneys. Fires burned steady, not desperate. Children slept through the night. Jacob measured once more during that freeze. Outer cabin, near freezing by dawn. Inner cabin, nearly 30 degrees warmer. He sat quietly with that knowledge. The neighbors had laughed when he began stacking logs inside his living room. Now they stacked their own. And in the quiet warmth of reduced space, winter lost a measure of its dominance. By the time the snow began to thin along the southern edges of the prairie, the inner cabins had already proven themselves more than a novelty. What started as one man, as quiet defiance of winter, had become an unspoken shift in how the settlement thought about shelter. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It crept in the way winter had gradually, almost reluctantly. The drifts along the north walls of cabins softened first, their hard ridges rounding under pale sunlight. Icicles that had hung like glass daggers from roof edges began to drip in steady rhythms during midday, only to refreeze again at night. Inside Jacob's cabin, the inner structure still stood solid and square. He had considered dismantling it once the worst cold passed, but each time he weighed the idea, he found no reason to remove it. Even on milder nights, the smaller space felt comfortable, efficient. The outer room could cool without consequence. The inner room remained dependable. One afternoon, as meltwater ran in thin lines beneath the snow crust, Eli stopped by with a coil of rope over his shoulder. You keeping it? Eli asked, nodding toward the inner cabin. I think so. Jacob replied. Thought it was just for winter. It was, Jacob said. But winter comes back. Eli chuckled at that. Fair point. The two men stood in the outer cabin, which now felt almost spacious compared to the tight warmth of the smaller room. With the fire low and the door cracked for fresh air, the chill no longer bit the same way. Funny thing, Eli said thoughtfully, I used to think a big room meant I demade it. Now I think a small one means I'll survive it. Jacob smiled faintly. Summer changes how we measure things. Winter corrects it. That phrase lingered long after Eli left. Over the following weeks, the settlement shifted into preparation mode. Fences needed mending, tools needed sharpening, seed orders were discussed. But beneath those practical tasks, a quieter awareness remained. Winter would return. And when it did, no one would build quite the same way again. Harris Doyle began planning an addition not outward, but inward. He intended to design his next cabin, once he could afford better lumber, with a permanent sleeping chamber integrated into the structure itself. Not an afterthought, not a makeshift box, but a deliberate smaller core within a larger room. It'll save wood every year, he told Jacob one evening. That is time I can use elsewhere. Martin Shaw had already begun sketching something similar in charcoal on scrap boards, a two-room concept, one small and insulated, one open and flexible. Even Caleb, who once laughed the loudest, admitted he would never again build a single tall, open room without some method of partitioning warmth. The lesson had taken root. Jacob found himself reflecting often on how simple the shift had been. He had not introduced new materials. He had not invented insulation from nothing. He had simply questioned volume. The prairie did not care how large a cabin appeared. It cared only about surface area and exposure. Every foot of wall facing north was a battleground. Every inch of ceiling allowed heat to rise and vanish. By building inward, he had shortened those distances. He had limited the territory the cold could claim. One cool evening in early April, when frost still silvered the grass at dawn but melted by noon, several neighbors gathered inside Jacob's outer cabin to discuss the coming year. The fire burned low. The inner cabin door stood open now, unnecessary in the softer air. "We learned something this winter," Harris said plainly. Eli nodded. "We learned pride does to keep you warm." Caleb added, "And space isn't always your friend." They spoke not with embarrassment, but with acceptance. The prairie had humbled them together. "What do you think folks back east would say?" Martin asked, leaning against the wall. "Building a cabin inside a cabin. They say we were short on sense," Harris replied. Jacob shook his head gently. "They say we were short on fuel." Laughter followed, but it was lighter than before. The inner cabin, once a symbol of oddity, now stood quietly as proof of adaptation. As days lengthened further, Jacob began making small modifications for summer use. He adjusted the ventilation gap to allow more airflow. He propped the inner door open during daylight, so the entire space felt unified again. But he did not dismantle it. The structure had become more than a winter device. It was a reminder. He remembered the first storm, the roar of wind against the outer walls, the way cold had poured into open space like water filling a basin. He remembered stepping into the smaller room and feeling immediate stillness. He remembered the thermometer reading 31 degrees warmer. The number itself had become almost symbolic among the neighbors. When someone complained about a draft, another might mutter, "Build yourself 31 degrees." It became shorthand for thinking differently. Late in the season, as mud replaced snow and the creek began to swell with meltwater, Jacob walked beyond the settlement for the first time in months. The prairie looked different without its white cover-brown grass flattened and matted, patches of dark earth exposed. He turned and looked back at the cluster of cabins. From a distance, they all looked the same. No one passing through would know that inside several of them stood smaller rooms within larger ones. No one would see the shift in understanding that had occurred. But it was there. He thought about future winters. Perhaps future settlers would build double-walled cabins from the start. Perhaps they would design sleeping chambers with lower ceilings and tighter seals. Perhaps they would call it something technical one day, thermal zoning maybe, or layered insulation. But here, in this place and time, it had been simpler. He had been tired of seeing his breath in bed. He had been tired of feeding a fire that warmed rafters more than hands. He had decided to heat only what mattered. The prairie wind, softer now, brushed across the grass. He returned to his cabin and stepped inside. The outer room smelled faintly of thawing wood and lingering smoke. The inner room waited, door open, no longer necessary for survival, but still solid. He ran his hand along its wall. It had endured the harshest nights of winter without complaint. He thought of the laughter when he first carried those logs inside. The looks exchanged behind his back. The whispered judgments. And then he thought of Eli stepping into the inner room for the first time during the great storm, his expression shifting from skepticism to recognition. That moment had been the true turning point. Not the measurement, not the storm. Recognition, the understanding that warmth did not require more fire. It required less waste. By the time summer arrived in full, the inner cabins remained standing in most homes. Some would eventually be modified into storage spaces during warm months. Others would serve as private corners for reading or mending. But when autumn returned and the doors would close again, the smaller rooms would once more become the heart of each cabin. Jacob sat on the edge of his bed that evening, the air mild, the fire unnecessary. He considered how easily he might have ignored the problem, how easily he might have simply cut more wood, accepted more exhaustion, blamed the prairie. Instead, he had reduced. In a land that demanded expansion, more land, more crops, more timber, he had found survival in contraction. Heat, he had learned, did not need grandeur. It needed boundaries. And when the first chill of the next autumn touched the air months later, he would close the inner door without hesitation, knowing exactly how much warmth waited inside. 31 degrees had changed more than a night as sleep. It had changed the way they built against winter.